still working our way through the book of Esther, and so we're going to be in chapters 5 and 6 today. And so next week, I think that we're going to be splitting our time between reviewing like what God has laid out for the spring festival calendar and the ways that those festivals were fulfilled and what that potentially means for us. And then we may have enough time to continue with our Esther study. So we'll see. I'll see if I can do a condensed version of what I have outlined for Esther. If not, we'll just talk about the festivals. But for this morning, I kind of want you to recall that there are times in your life when you're just not sure what God is doing. And you may be in one of those times now. And there also may be other times when you're reasonably sure what God is doing, but then things don't work out the way that you thought they would. And sometimes when you're going through a difficult season and you think that maybe you can see the end of that season on the horizon, just as you're about to get out of the woods, something else bad happens. And so there are just a lot of bad things that happen in everybody's life, and many of them just don't seem to make that much sense. And these are the times that we really need to understand what it means to trust in the providence of God. And so the book of Esther is a great place to learn about that. And J. Vernon McGee makes the claim that this is the primary lesson and the reason, in fact, that this book is included in the Bible. And I think I might agree with him. So in this book, a lot of bad things happen that don't really seem to make much sense. And so Mordecai saved the king's life, and then his enemy Haman is promoted over him. And then Haman talks the king into making an irrevocable decree to have all the Jews in the kingdom exterminated. And when it looks like maybe the Jews can be saved because the queen happens to be Jewish, we find out that she can be killed just for approaching the king. And he may very well want to have her killed because he's spending his nights with other women. But, chapter 4 finished with this sort of climactic moment where Esther decides to actually put her trust in God and risk going before the king and pleading on behalf of the people. And so the second part of verse 16 said that I will go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So the tension in the story seems to be just about as high as it can get. And the stage has been set for God to show up and save his people if that's what's going to happen. And so now's the time for that to happen. And so let's see what does happen. So Esther and Mordecai and all their friends and Esther's ladies in waiting or whatever, they pray and they go without food and water for 3 days. And then on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And so remember that if the king does not acknowledge her by holding out his golden scepter, then she's going to be put to death. And so she's just standing there silently waiting to see what he'll do. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So that's kind of a relief. At least she's not dead yet. Okay. But, how exactly do you bring up this thing that she has to talk to the king about? I mean, she has to tell him that she's basically deceived him by not telling him that she's Jewish. And then she has to find a way for him to work around an irrevocable decree to have her and all of her people killed. So it's not an easy subject to bring up, even if the person that you're talking to does not have the power to have you killed for no reason at all. And with this guy, any reason at all for him to remove like unpleasant things from his own experience seems to be enough reason for him to do just about anything at all. And so how does she break the silence and get into the issues that are sort of between them? Well, she doesn't need to. The king breaks the silence. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What's your request? It shall be given you, even to half of my kingdom." And so not only does he acknowledge her and he reacts favorably to her presence, he's just promised to grant whatever her request is. So there's not a lot more you could ask for here. And so maybe it's true that God has gone before her and made way for her to save the people. And so she should just tell the king what the deal is, and we'll get the resolution to this story that we're looking for right here, right now. So what does she ask for? Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." So wait, what? Right? So she can ask for anything she wants, and she asks him to come to dinner with Haman. And it seems a little bit crazy. But before we can really figure out what's going on, the three of them are sitting around eating and drinking together, and the king asks her again what her request is. And so at least this guy's smart enough to know that she wouldn't risk death just to have dinner. All right, she must want something. And so he says, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And so maybe Esther does know what she's doing, right? So this must be the right time for her to take the plunge. And so, the king has had some time to remember how awesome and how beautiful she is. And he has a few drinks in him. And so she should do it. All right. She says, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So now there's some new tension building in the story, and we're not really sure what's going on. And so is she putting this off because she's scared? Does she have some master plan that we don't know about? Is she squandering this, what appears to be a golden opportunity to accomplish what we think must be the will of God? And so that resolution that we were looking for and that sort of seemed imminent has slipped away until potentially tomorrow night's banquet. And with the tension this high, you would quite expect that the very next scene in the story would be the next night's feast. There's really, couldn't really possibly be anything that happens in the next 24 hours that adds much to this story. But instead, the author starts into something that seems like it's going to be difficult to hold our interest, because what we want to hear about is Esther and the king. And it says that Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. Well, that's nice, but who cares, right? Why are we talking about this? And then it tells us. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. So Haman runs into Mordecai again, and the tension just gets kicked up a notch. And the last time that Haman experienced this kind of interaction with Mordecai, he planned the extinction of the entire Jewish race. And so what's he going to do this time? Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself, and he went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. So that's kind of interesting. He hasn't really done or said anything about Mordecai yet. He's just really building himself up in front of his wife and friends. Seems like, maybe he just needs his ego stroked. I mean, he's doing it himself, but that's what it looks like is going on here. And then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king." This guy's really full of himself. And it looks like this thing that Esther is doing is kind of making it worse. And so that's his final evidence of how awesome he is. But then he says, "Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." So he has all this awesome stuff to say about himself, but it doesn't mean anything to him as long as Mordecai sits at the gate. This guy's like in 4th grade. And it seems like the author has taken this little interlude just to point out how foolish and juvenile Haman really is. And so, how does a guy like this even get into the position that he's in? And so I wonder if it still works the same way. Wink, wink, right? And so, but then Haman's wife and friends chime in, and they say, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. And so this verse is almost like a reality check for the reader of the story. And so Haman may be a total jackass, but he's also the second most powerful person in the world. And so Mordecai may not survive the next 24 hours. And so this hateful middle school man-child might very well move quickly enough that, Esther putting off talking to the king could cost Mordecai his life. And, Esther may have miscalculated here. And so while she's, preparing dinner, Haman is preparing to kill Mordecai. And at the same time that they are sitting around a table, eating and drinking the next night, Mordecai may be impaled on the top of this 75-foot tall stake. And so Haman's servants are going to work all night to build this giant stake in his backyard to put Mordecai on. And Esther and Mordecai can't really do anything about it because they don't even know. And so when we started this chapter, it sure looked like, God was about to show up and bring resolution to this problem. Esther had decided to be brave, and she had decided to risk herself by trusting in God and talking to the king on behalf of the people. And God had orchestrated a way to use her to save his people. But by the end of the chapter, God has not shown up miraculously the way that we kind of would have expected him to. And Esther has put off talking to the king, and we're not really sure why. But we are sure that Haman is a total jackass, and that Mordecai's life is about to feed Haman's ego. And it looks very much like it would take a miracle to save Mordecai now. And so far in the book of Esther, we haven't seen any miracles. And so I'm just going to bring up again how similar this story is to what life looks like today in the world that we live in. Bad things happen to us that we don't understand. And we sometimes see the resolution to the giant thing that we're facing just over the horizon, right? We're going to make it. And then before we get there, we find that things are even worse than we thought. And sometimes things are so out of control that we wonder how God is ever going to bring them back. Things are so wrong that we can't see how they can be made right. And sometimes in our lives, we just don't understand what God could possibly be doing. All right? I mean, if the story of Esther stopped right where it is now, I don't see how any sage or pastor or counselor could explain why these things are happening. There's really no evidence of God's hand. And it sure looks like Haman has more control over the fate of God's people than God does. And the only people who have even kind of worked for good or for God are not at all aware of the immediate danger that they're in. And it's very difficult to understand why God has allowed the things that he has allowed. But the story's not over. And neither is your story. All right, we're going to continue in this story of Esther, and we're going to see if God really is in control and if he's able to keep his promises. And since chapter 5 ended with the coming of night, it would be fair to assume that chapter 6 will start with the following morning. But it doesn't. It just switches scenes. It says on that night the king could not sleep. And so this is the same night that Haman's servants are out building a giant thing to impale Mordecai on, and the king can't sleep. And so what do you think the king usually does when he can't sleep? Right? This guy has millions of options, and so he can have any food made that he wants. He can go for a walk in the most beautiful palace in the world. He's just seen his queen, who won the empire's beauty contest. He could call her to his room. If that doesn't sound great, he has the hundreds of other girls from the contest that he has in a cage just down the hall from his bedroom, and so he can call any of them to his room. He can do anything he pleases. All right? But it looks like this guy really, really does want to go to sleep, because it says that he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds and chronicles, and they were read before the king. So these are not dramatized history books. Okay, these are like spreadsheets with names and actions and dates and resolutions or outcomes. And so just about any scholar who has taken a look at these kinds of chronicles will attest to the fact that they are anything but riveting. Okay? In all likelihood, he deliberately brought these in so that he would sleep. Okay? But it doesn't work. And the king does not go to sleep. And hours pass, and dawn approaches, and the king is still being read the chronicles, and he's still listening. Verse 2 says, "It was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus." And so just as Haman's servants are completing building their 75-foot tall stake to impale Mordecai on, the king's servants are reading to him about how Mordecai saved his life. And at the moment that the king is being reminded about Mordecai and his deeds, Haman is awake and rushing to the palace to talk to the king about having Mordecai executed. All right. There we go. So maybe the king asked questions about all the things in the Chronicles, but it tells us that this one certainly caught his attention. It says, "And the king said, 'What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' The king's young men who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" And so this would have really shocked and embarrassed the king. Persian kings were absolutely famous for their rewards to people that served them in any kind of even a little bit extraordinary way. And so they took pride in rewarding good service because it was their way of keeping morale up and encouraging loyalty in people. And so if you save the king's life, you can expect to be governor of a province or something like that. But Mordecai had saved the king's life 4 years ago at this point, and no one has even mentioned it or really even been made aware of it. So this king kind of jumps out of bed to make this the first thing he's going to accomplish today. But we've seen that this guy almost always asks for advice. He doesn't really seem to discriminate much about who he gets his advice from. So he asks his servants who's available to him that's already in the court. And at this hour, the king can expect that the court is empty. All right, that's why he asks. And so if he expected the court to be full of petitioners and his court officials, he may have been very specific about who he wanted to talk to, but he's just trying to figure out if there's anyone there yet at all. And the passage says that Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And so Haman knows it's early, right? And he probably doesn't expect to see the king right away, but he really wants to be at the front of the line so that he can get on with his plan to have Mordecai killed. So his finished stake is sticking up above the city buildings, and he just cannot wait to see Mordecai stuck on it. The king's servants go check out what they expect to be an empty court, and they come back and they say that Haman is there standing in the court, and the king said, "Let him come in." So the king's excited to talk to Haman because he's kind of at a loss for what to do for Mordecai. And Haman is excited to talk to the king because the king is up and waiting just to talk to him. So Haman rushes into the king, but he's sidetracked from his plan to talk about Mordecai when the king asks him what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman's surprised. He came to talk about one of his favorite things, revenge. But the king has distracted him by wanting to talk about Haman's very favorite thing, himself. All right, this is funny. It says that Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And so the irony of this situation is almost unbelievable, right? It would seem made up if it were not so ridiculous. Haman is trying to publicly shame and execute Mordecai, while the king wants to publicly honor and exalt Mordecai. And because the king doesn't mention Mordecai's name here, Haman assumes that they're talking about him. And it's him that will be honored. And so he takes his time to answer. He's been dreaming of this moment his entire life. And he can picture in his mind all the things that he is about to list. And he says, "Let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" So Haman is living his own dream here This is everything that he could want. And he says it 3 times in this passage. Actually, I skipped the verse with the first one, but here are 2 of the 3 times that he says, the man whom the king delights to honor. He really likes this idea. All right, he really wants to be the man whom the king delights to honor. But the king sort of slaps him out of his daydream when he says, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. All right, so this is the giant reversal of fortunes that this book does, and it's only Haman that's fully aware of what just happened. All right? Only Haman knows about the giant stake that he has built that you can see from the whole city and who he was planning to put on it. All right? He's the only one that knows that he just spent all night dreaming of putting this guy in his place for not showing enough respect to the great Haman. And only Haman knows that he will be leading around the city and proclaiming the greatness of the very man that he sought to destroy. There's almost no audience at all for this enormous reversal that we see in this passage. And that line that Haman was so fond of about being the man the king delights in honoring, Haman doesn't just have to watch it being said about Mordecai. He has to yell it himself to the whole city. All right, so like in a single moment, Haman's dream world has crumbled into his worst nightmare. And when it's all over, verse 12 says that Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. So the Jewish people in this story had fasted and prayed for 3 days to ask God to be with Queen Esther so that they could be saved. And this is the 4th day. They've all started eating and drinking again. They've returned to work. And on this 4th day, Mordecai is not impaled on a stake as his enemy had planned. All right. Instead, he's dressed in the king's clothes and put on the king's horse and honored all around the city. And Haman doesn't get the revenge that he's after. Instead, it's him that's covering his face in shame and mourning. And the reversal here is really more than anyone could have hoped for. And in a lot of ways, it's the turning point for this book. Okay, we had expected that, Esther going before the king was going to be the turning point. But really, even after the king agreed to grant whatever Esther requested, things continued to get worse. And after the events of this chapter, even Haman's wife and friends know that, the balance of power has shifted. All right, check out what they say to him in verse 13. It says that Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And then the wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So who is it that is responsible for this great reversal that we've seen in this story? All right. It rather looked like Esther and or Mordecai was going to be the hero of this story, but they're fast asleep when things actually start to happen. All right. And so they didn't really do it. Who is responsible for this great reversal of fortunes? And so you have to start kind of asking these kinds of questions. Whose wisdom or cunning or cleverness makes all these things happen? Whose plan is it that's being executed? Who should we be talking about that should get the glory for the way things are turning out? You know what I mean? Like, who is it really? Who kept the king awake all night? And why did the king, who obviously often chooses other things, decide to read the book of Chronicles? And how on earth did a Persian king forget to reward a loyal servant? That doesn't happen. Okay? How did Haman happen to be in court at the exact right time that the king is looking for advice? Why did the king neglect to mention Mordecai's name as the person that he wants to honor? And what kind of person would just assume that the king was talking about them? Why does Haman ask that a noble carry out these instructions that he gives the king instead of a servant like who does everything else? Okay, every single one of these things is not weird by itself. And, they're certainly not impossible. Many of them aren't even out of character for the people that do them. But if you put them all together, it just screams that there's someone behind the scenes. All right, someone that has been patiently putting this plan together for a very long time. And the answer to all of these questions, obviously, is God. Okay, God is responsible for the way that this story is going. It's God's plan that's working out in order to fulfill God's promises. And the word that theologians use to describe this way of God working is providence. All right? Providence is defined as the way that God directs the flow of human history through the ordinary lives of individuals in order to fulfill his promises. So how exactly have we seen the providence of God in this story? All right, well, we thought it was going to take a miracle to save Mordecai. He was as good as dead. Okay, but God is so powerful that he actually doesn't need to resort to the supernatural or puppeteering of people in order to get his will accomplished. God has been orchestrating all these events from before the time the people even knew there was an issue. And he's done it all without violating human responsibility for their actions or human agency to make their own decisions. Okay? Each character in this story has done what they wanted or, just what they chose to do. And yet God has used their decisions to weave things together to make his will be done and his promises come true. And from within this story, it looks like, Mordecai's been cheated of the reward that he deserves for saving the king's life. And then, his enemy's promoted for no good reason at all. It sure looks like the king has forgotten him, and by extension, that God has forgotten him. And then he finds out that every single Jew in the kingdom has been sentenced to death. But, there's a couple of things that Mordecai doesn't know. Things are different from God's point of view. From God's position in this story, he hadn't forgotten to give Mordecai his reward. He's just waiting for the time when Mordecai would need it the most. All right? God knew that at some time in the future, Mordecai would have an enemy that would build a 75-foot tall stake in his backyard to impale Mordecai on. And if things had gone the way that Mordecai wanted, this card would have already been played way before it actually was. If Mordecai were putting together the order of events and when things were going to go down, it would have been very different from the way that it actually went down. Mordecai would have messed things up if it were on his timing. But God's timing is perfect. He knew exactly the right time to play the cards that he had. And it worked out just the way that God would want it to. So God holds all the cards, and God knows just when to play each card. So it seems like an easy one to apply to our lives, right? I mean, you ever have a hard time seeing what God's doing? You ever felt like you were stuck somewhere waiting for God to show up? Right? What cards does God hold that you're pretty sure he should have already played? Are there parts of your life where it seems like God has forgotten you? Does your life ever seem unfair? Right? I mean, really, this should be a piece of cake. But I really want to point out a very important distinction here. We will almost always decide to trust God when we can see what he's up to and we understand what he's doing. And if he will show us how he plans to use the bad things that happen in our life, then we will often make the choice to trust his plan. And that's exactly why we're always trying to figure out what he's doing. Okay, when we can't figure it out, we ask the people around us. We keep looking for what God has got going on until we find an answer that we can settle into. And if we can't find an answer, then we're like paralyzed and unable to move forward and unable to release the situation to God. But that's not at all the way that this is supposed to work. Okay, God doesn't tell Mordecai why the king forgot about him. He doesn't tell Esther or Mordecai why the Jews are targeted for massacre. Nobody in this story knows why any of these things are happening. But God calls Mordecai to believe that no matter how bad things look, God will keep his promises. All right, so in the second part of John 13:7, Jesus says to Peter, "What I am doing, you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." And that is exactly the type of faith that God is calling on his people to have at all times and places. All right, it's the kind of faith that doesn't concern itself with why things are happening. Even when we don't understand the why of things or how God will use the various situations, we should be able to relax into knowing that someday we will understand. And so today, without understanding, we're going to put our trust in God. And if there have not already been, there will be times in your story when you do not see what God is doing. All right? And so there will also be times when it seems like there's nothing that could possibly happen that could make God's promises come true. And even though you may ask your pastor or ask your friends or your family, they may not know either, or you may not be able to process their answer. And that is exactly the way that God has designed the system. Okay? From within the story, bad things look very bad. And from within the story, bad things often look totally unredeemable. All right, so you've probably heard this one used in all kinds of messed up contexts and as a trite little thing that's supposed to make you feel better when things are going bad. But Romans 8:28 says that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. But what this passage is saying here really is that God holds all the cards, and God knows exactly when to play them. All right? It doesn't at all mean that you're not going to deal with very hard things. And even when you don't understand things right now, someday you will. And when that day comes, you'll actually be quite grateful for every moment that you put your trust in God. In the next chapter of Romans, Paul quotes Isaiah when he says, "Behold, I'm laying a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." And so one day, our God is going to fix everything that's broken. And one day, every single promise that he has ever made to anyone will be fulfilled. And how do we know that? Right? How do we know that God is strong enough to fix all that's broken? And that he loves us enough to keep all of his promises to us? Because even with all of its intricately laid plans unfolding over many years, the book of Esther is just a shadow of a much larger story with much more intricate plans unfolding over a much longer time span. Okay, in the first couple of pages of the Bible, we get our first glimpse of the fact that God has a plan and some inkling of what that plan is. And it's a plan that sort of requires a perfect hero born of the offspring of Eve that will somehow have the power to conquer sin and death and ultimately crush the head of Satan. Okay? But things don't always look like they're going to work out. It's a pretty bumpy road to get from there to when things do come to a conclusion. There are some substantial obstacles that need to be overcome, even to get this hero into the world. All right? But God keeps his promises. And some amazing things transpire as God makes things work out. And God sets up a pattern for what it looks like for God to read his promises, right? So like barren women give birth over and over and over again in order for God's promises to be kept. You know, enslaved people are rescued from the most powerful nation on earth, and then the nation is destroyed. Right? The people are rebellious over and over again. They're hard-headed and stiff-necked, the Bible calls them, but God shows patience, and he keeps them safe, somewhat safe, intact at least. So heroes are born in the Bible, and they live and they fail over and over again to live up to God's standards. And they fail at redeeming the people. Okay? And then, no one hears from God for 400 years. Radio silence. It's like God has given up on them. But God's plan is not like our plans. It's not like anything that we would put together. And at just the right time, the hero is born to a virgin girl named Mary. Another miraculous birth, right? The apex of miraculous births. And the guy who will conquer sin and death and rebuild the broken relationship between man and God comes into the world in a barn in a small town to an unwed teenaged mother. And he's immediately in danger, and his family flees to Egypt to keep him alive. And when the danger passes, they return to Nazareth, and our hero grows up learning a blue-collar trade. Somewhere around the age of 30, he begins to reveal himself publicly. He gathers a small group of people around him that are essentially the outcasts and the looked down on in that society. And he begins speaking in crowds and refuting the things that the religious teachers are saying and healing the sick. And then on a seemingly random Sunday morning, he gets on a baby donkey and he rides into Jerusalem, and the people proclaim him king. And after all those years of silence, the Messiah has finally come, and they can't wait for him to free them from Roman oppression. But that's not what he does. And, things look pretty good from within the story for just that moment when they're cheering for their king. But then they go back to bad very quickly. And in one night, one of his disciples betrays him, and another one claims to not even know him. And the religious leaders capture him, and the local Roman political leader sentences him to death. And before you know what's going on, the hero that's supposed to crush Satan's head is hanging naked on a Roman cross. And over the last weeks, we've pointed out all kinds of parallels between, us and the king of Persia. We've also made some comparisons between Esther and Jesus, and as far as heroes go or whatever. And so that's what this is Esther goes from a death sentence to a parade in just the nick of time. All right? And Jesus goes from a parade to a death sentence and ends up hanging on a cross. And that's not what's supposed to happen. All right? They had thought that this hero was the one that was promised to Eve and that would save them. And now his body is lying lifeless in a borrowed tomb. And, the disciples lock themselves up for fear that the same thing is going to happen to them. And then they all return to their jobs. And the rest of his followers, mourn the loss of the freedom that they thought they were going to get. And it seems like maybe no generation ever really learns the lesson that the book of Esther has to teach. Seems like we can never really internalize that it's God who holds all the cards. And we can't really get our head around the fact that he has cards that we don't even know exist. And no matter how many stories we hear and no matter how many times we experience it, why can't we remember that he knows exactly the right time to play his cards? So the situation looks completely without hope to the disciples and the followers of Jesus. The guy that their entire belief system was built around was dead and in the ground. No situation has ever looked quite as much like there was no way for God to make good on his promises. Okay, who could have known that God had a resurrection card? All right. But God plays that card on the third day. And according to Philippians 2:9, the way that God treats the man whom he delights to honor is that he gives him a name above every other name in the universe. And because God raised Jesus from the dead, we can know that if we put our trust in him, we don't have to fear death any longer. All right? We can know, because Jesus was raised from the dead, that sin has been conquered. All right? And it doesn't have the power to condemn us any longer. And because Jesus was raised from the dead, we can know that Satan has been defeated. And because God raised Jesus from the dead, we can know that Jesus can save anyone who puts their faith in him. All right, I have no idea what kind of struggles most of you face today. All right, I have no idea what parts of your story seem confusing to you right now. I don't know where you're having a difficult time finding hope. But there is a thing that I know. All right, I know that God loved the world in such a way that he gave his only son to be crucified on a cross so that we wouldn't have to die and so that he could forgive our sins because Jesus paid the price that we deserve to pay and so that we could spend our entire eternal lives not being separated from our Creator and God. God loves you. And he has proven it. All right, his love has caused him to take action. And that action has paved a way for you to spend eternity with him. All right, he will not leave you alone in your suffering, and he holds all the cards. He's powerful enough to raise Jesus from the dead, and so he's powerful enough to overcome whatever obstacles you're facing, and he's planning to work all of your hardships for your good by his providence, if you'll stop clinging to control of your life. All right, so you may not understand right now what he's doing, but someday you will. And you will know then that you need to trust him now. All right, you should do that more often than you do. And so should I.